Hi, just a quick message from me before we start. I'd like to give Nij a big thank you for coming on the first episode of this series. What this series is trying to achieve is I want to talk to the best minds in the business. I want to talk to the best handlers who've had years and years of experience under their belt. And I want to bring their handling techniques, their thoughts, their perspective to you, the audience. And I thought Nij would be a great person to start with, and he was very generous with his time, and I think we recorded a great episode. If you want to hear more from Nij, there's links down below wherever you're watching this. This is available on YouTube and all the audio platforms. I'd really recommend you checking out more on Nij's work because he really is very generous with his time and with his knowledge. Right, I think we'll get to it then. Toodles. Yeah, so thank you, Nij, for coming on. What I wanted to start with is something that I've sort of dealt with recently. I've got a dog now that can be a bit more sensitive, a bit more timid. And I find working with more sensitive dogs one of the sort of most frustrating things that I've dealt with working with sheepdogs, because I just hate that feeling of sort of working with a dog and they're not sure, and then they're looking at you for guidance and reassurance. And I struggle with what to tell them, and I struggle to communicate. Actually, it's all right. You don't have to worry. I was just wondering, how do you approach working with more sensitive dogs, and what's something somebody could do at home just to help a dog if they're not as sure on the sheep, or if they're naturally a bit more timid?
Sure. Well, most of the dogs, I think, at some point are sensitive. So if you start with a young puppy, they, because they have a lack of experience, they're going to be sensitive and to some point anxious, nervous. Some puppies grow up and they retain those sort of characteristics far more so than others. Others develop what we call coping mechanisms, while others have less so. And I would say probably in excess of 80% of the dogs that I have come to me for training are of a sensitive nature.
Okay.
And uh, my whole philosophy to training dogs is almost mapped out from start to finish. So what I mean by that is that I know the processes uh, that I want to sort of instill in the dog, and I know the stages that I want to achieve and the elements I want to achieve. But within that, I don't put a time frame into that. So,
Okay.
so I've really, over the last sort of 35 years, I've had uh, a great frustration, like yourself, with sensitive dogs. And the more I try and avoid them, the more I get this issue. The sort of first touch I had with a sensitive dog was a dog called Fly, who went back to John Rian's moss and sweep lines. And moss and sweep were tough dogs, and Sod's Law would have it that I ended up with a sensitive one. But it was a hell of a learning curve for me, which is that um, I've always inherently been a fixer. I'm not one for buying dogs and spending a lot of money on dogs. And so whatever I'm faced with, I have to fix. And the problems that sensitive dogs pose are almost bipolar. So what I mean by that is that our natural instinct when faced with a dog that refuses to do something because it's frightened is to pander to it, to sort of um, be nice and to sort of try and cajole it into
Okay.
like we do with a child. You know, you want to put your arms around them and say it'll be okay.
Yeah.
The fine line that you tread there is that are you reinforcing that problem? So I
Hmm.
think sensitivity and fear are sort of go hand in hand. So if a dog presents fear, the question you're faced with is, are you going to reinforce that and make that problem worse by being sympathetic?
Yeah.
Or should you take a tougher line? And what I found myself doing is that yes, I have this sympathetic ear, that sort of side of me, and I bear that in mind. But what I've noticed over the years is that the sensitive dogs that I've had, my feeling was that I have to be almost firmer and tougher on them. But sorry, let me backtrack. I have to be firmer with them in terms of insisting that they are going to do something. Let's look at a practical situation. So,
Yeah.
if you ask a sensitive dog to go between the sheep and the fence,
Yeah.
sensitive dogs are going to say, "No, I'm not doing that."
Yeah. That's the exact
But
problem I've been having.
yeah, so
Look, you mention it.
your mind then says, "Well, do I allow it to escape and not do that job, or do I help the dog to do?" So
Hmm.
I take a firmer line in that situation, and what I always do is I put a lead on a dog, usually about 8 foot or something, and I pick the lead up. As soon as I see hesitation, I pick the lead up, which I always sort of analogize as holding a child's hand and say, "You have no choice, but we are going to do this, and we're going to do it together."
Okay. Yeah.
So it's not going to kill you, but I'll come with you. And
Yeah.
so gradually the dog gets more and more confident. Um, the reason I'm forceful in that situation is because we all know that until a dog is confident enough to be able to go into tight corners and get sheep out, we're
Hmm.
going to get stuck at trials.
Yeah.
We're going to get stuck on the farm as well. So in that situation, um, a little bit of force is called for, but the force is gentle guidance, and it's more akin to you haven't got a choice, but I'm going to do it with you. So it's leading by example. Gradually, as the confidence builds, you let them do more and more. Of course, you don't have to start with a tight gap. You can always leave a couple of meters so that the puppy sees that there is a choice. Um, On another aspect altogether, I strongly believe that puppies that are nervous or anxious should be given the opportunity to cope and develop coping mechanisms. So you put them in difficult situations, whatever they are, it doesn't have to be with the sheep, and they will develop coping mechanisms. I've actually, with my 4.5-year-old, Caps, as many of the people will know, has had a lot of health issues lately. So he's moved in from the kennel into the house.
Yeah.
I was vacuuming the kitchen last night. Now people are going to be impressed with that, aren't they? Um, and he was moving around to avoid the vacuum cleaner, and
Okay.
and I was being irritated by that because the logic says the vacuum cleaner's not going to kill you, so stop avoiding it. So my
Yeah.
response to that was to put him on his bed, to call him past the vacuum cleaner, and in that situation, the vacuum cleaner is the sheep and the fence.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
called him through and I said, "You will lie down." So I told him to lie down on his bed, and then I carried on vacuuming and then mopping and all the rest of it. But that situation is how you teach a coping mechanism. So you don't avoid the problem, you handle it delicately, and then you become less and less delicate as the dog becomes more experienced. And what you're also teaching the dog is that sometimes, as you said, most of us get angry or frustrated. It's better to avoid that stage and be stronger in your handling and teach the dog that in difficult situations, no is not going to be accepted, but I will help you. So you teach them that you're a firm handler, and then they become less stressed by the fact that they know you're going to help them.
Hmm. Yeah, my approach towards the situation I had was sort of to change the environment in which is working in. So I changed fields and I changed the sheep. And what I did then was I stopped giving commands. I tried to make the training process more enjoyable because I was worrying that because it started around when I started with whistles. And I thought, okay, she's not sure what's going on. I'm
Mm.
confusing her. I'm overloading her with information. So what I did was I put my shorts on and I put my running shoes on and I just ran around the field, letting her follow, letting her play, and that sort of seemed to help quite a lot. You mentioned sort of trying to show that you're trying to help rather than getting angry and frustrated. Sort of that anger was my first obstacle with training dogs. What I used to do was if I had a bad week and on the weekends I thought, oh, I better go and take the dog. And then what would happen if something went wrong? I would, like her being timid, oh, come on. I'd get frustrated in myself and I'd get angry. And what I learned quickly was what I was doing was when things weren't going wrong, I was taking out all my frustration out on the dog. So everything
Yeah,
that went wrong in the week, it was building up actually on the field and the training process. Um, so what I then learned obviously was that doesn't help nobody. This is not fair on them. It's not fair on
mm.
me either. How sort of how do you start understanding that? How do you get a feel for helping the dogs? How do you? Because my mindset shifted from I am a teacher, you listen to me, to more sort of something where we help each other. We're a team. We're a partnership. Do you find that's something that people take time to understand?
I think there's a lot of pressure on people to train in a particular way, and there has to be an individual approach for every single dog. The frustrations that you mention, something that I've developed. I think I probably always had it because I'm a Gemini, and there are very two distinct parts of me. I can be two different people,
Yeah,
and so when I'm working with a dog and I'm faced with a problem, I'm often very, very quick nowadays, particularly, to ask myself, what do I think caused that problem? So, was it out and out refusal, or
yeah,
was there a reason for that refusal? And if I can justify that there was a reason for that refusal, then I would let it go. Equally, I would ask myself, and I would be quite honest with that, is did I cause that problem? So, with yourself, you sort of said that you'd had a frustrating week, and then you're taking that onto the training field,
yeah,
and so it's important that we're honest with ourselves, and in the ideal world, we'd go and train, and everything would be sort of very calm and peaceful, and we would um, do the right thing by the dog. But in reality, life's not that perfect. So I tend to, I think where my solutions come from is that when I'm training a young dog, although I know the journey I wish to undertake, I don't put a time frame on that.
okay,
And as I've got older, I've also changed because I've also changed in the sense that there's no time frame, but there is also no order. I don't stick to a particular order
okay,
of training. So sometimes if you identify a strength in your puppy,
hmm.
then maybe stick to that strength, and so that you develop a little bit of trust in your relationship, and probably trust is key to me with working with young puppies. So even before we go to sheep, I want to teach puppies two things. So trust has two different branches to it. Trust me, I'm on your side. Trust me, I'm not trying to stop you having fun. Trust me that if you want to work, I want you to work. If you want to chase and do all these things, that's perfectly okay. The other branch of trust is trust me, I can stop you if I want to.
Okay.
So I I teach the puppies a range of about me. I have a range of how I command or how I communicate with the puppy. Most of the time, 9 out of 10 times, I'm incredibly softly spoken. I whisper. I whistle. I whistle from actually a much earlier age, so whistling doesn't come later in their life. It comes right at the onset. If I
Okay.
think my puppies can hear, I introduce a recall whistle. Of course, it's not a recall whistle. It's actually my recall whistle is associated with feeding times. So when I'm
Okay.
feeding them, I introduce a recall whistle, and then later it becomes recall because if they want food, they're going to have to come to me. So once we sort of establish that 9 out of 10 times I'm going to be calm, very softly spoken, I then, as a tactic, as a way of teaching the dog that I'm not always going to be like that. So the 1 in 10 times I overreact, and
Okay.
the overreaction is simply to just go, hey,
Hmm.
or, and this is one of the most stupid tactics I've ever used in my life,
Yeah.
but it's incredibly successful. I'll give you the scenario first. I had a dog called Cody, and Cody would only ever run uh, anti-clockwise. So it was always in a way when he started training, and I couldn't stop him. He would go past me every single time. And so, having tried everything else, I blew a raspberry,
Okay.
and he turned
Gosh.
and went because it was alien to him. He turned and went the other way. So it was that element of surprise that,
Okay.
and I use that element of surprise now with dogs. So if a dog's not listening to me, I touch them on the back end and blow a raspberry, and because it's so alien a sound to them, that they often turn around and say, "What was that?" And then I just carry on as normal. So the sort of pressure command, the heightened equivalent to shouting,
Hmm.
and that 1 in 10 command is actually not delivered in anger and frustration. It's delivered as a technique. So that's sort of my get out of jail card in a lot of situations. As the puppy gets older, there are elements where they're going to try things on, and perhaps I use a lot more movement towards the puppy. So if I call a puppy, I tend to go towards them so that they're aware that ignoring me is not an option. But it's a lot of these things are set into stone much earlier before we start working.
Yeah. Funny you mentioned that. Did I see something on your Facebook the other day that you had a sort of 9-month-old puppy and it was his fourth time on the sheep? Am I right to say that?
Yeah, I've got a young guy who he's only 10 years old, and he is very frustrated because the only time he can train is when he comes to me, and there's a lot of frustration for him because he wants to do this every day, and he hasn't quite parents haven't quite got around to putting a trading pen up because they run a very large farm, some 6,000 sheep. So
Okay.
um, uh,
Because what I was going to ask was when do you start the train process? Do you start training them when they're a bit older? Because the way I do it is, um, as soon as they sort of look at sheep, recognize sheep, I'll have them playing with sheep. I'll try and
sure.
start as early as possible, but there's different ways of doing things. I wondered if maybe you'd sort of hold that off, maybe start them slightly older.
No, on the contrary, it can vary. I don't put a date on when I want to start work. I think there's a lot of confusion about the word training because,
Okay.
and particularly on social media, people are arguing about what is the right age to start training, but they never ever define what they're training for.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
so for me, training is that trust building that I mentioned, and that trust building can start at 7 or 8 weeks. That training is lead and collar training. I place a lot of emphasis on lead and collar training
Mm.
because I want it to be done in a very sensitive manner, so that I'm not getting a lot of excessive pulling. I'm not saying I'm a control freak, and I'm not saying I'm doing these things robotically 4 times a day. But I'm setting these things into stone very, very gradually. So if I think that a puppy is ready for work by 4 or 5 months, I have no problem because I'll take them and let them off with a training pen and just see what their reactions are. But even at that point, my priority is getting the dogs to trust me, come back to me, and also to run past me while I'm
Okay.
standing outside the training pen. So if I feel that if a puppy runs past me, it trusts me.
Mm.
Going back to that 10-year-old, he was getting incredibly frustrated because the dog's now 12 months old and wants to work, and he can't catch the dog. To be fair, neither of us could catch the dog. So for 20 minutes, he was getting angry and frustrated. And he plays rugby. So I gave him an analogy and I said, "What is the aim of rugby?" And he said, "To score and to stop them scoring." So
Mm.
we'd got the sheep in the corner, or on, well, it was a circular fence, but they were on the fence.
Yeah.
And the dog is growing side to side, and he hasn't got a stop on the dog.
Okay.
And so he's getting angry with himself. He's getting angry because he hasn't got a training pen. He's getting angry because he doesn't want to appear like he's failing in front of his mum.
Mm.
So I explained to him that the aim is to score. And I said, "Is the dog scoring? In other words, is the dog getting past you?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, why are you disappointed? Because if you were playing rugby and it was 0-0, you would not be disappointed."
Yeah.
And once he understood that, all of the anger, frustration disappeared. Eventually, he stopped the dog, not me, which was great for him. And the following week, so the session you saw, he was actually in control of his emotions and he stopped the dog pretty much at will. It's not 100%, but it doesn't need to be 100%.
Mm.
But he now has the knowledge that he can stop the dog without getting angry, frustrated.
Yeah. If we could go back to, you mentioned something earlier about the importance of showing the puppy that they trust you, but also to know that you're the boss. I'd like to tell you sort of not an argument, but discussion I was having with my mum, and then she was saying we are on about sort of male and female handlers, and she said, "Oh, it's easier for men because you have deep voices, you're more authoritative," and that was something I disagreed with. Um, when I'm training, I try to shout as little as possible just so that it keeps its effect. And yes,
Mhm.
maybe my voice would have I could be louder, it could be deeper with training when I tell them off. I don't necessarily think that means that it's more authoritative. What I was trying to tell her was that you sort of build authority in different ways. So I was wondering, how you mentioned sort of early lead training and, sort of being calm and, trying to show them who's boss at an early age. Is that your way of showing them authority rather than actually showing authority through shouting and through being vocal?
My, I'm not saying I've always been a calm handler. It's definitely not true. But my alternative to shouting is repeating yourself. So
Okay.
I repeat. If I go stand, I don't say stand once. I'll go stand, 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 stand. But the puppy already has knowledge before we start sheep work that I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to give in. Uh,
Okay.
I don't have to win the battle, but I'm going to keep taking part. A bit like the young lad trying to stop the dog for 20
Mm.
minutes. It's not that I'm trying to stop you, it's that I'm trying to stop you scoring. And sometimes also where a stop is concerned, um, you've got to pick your battles. If you know you've got a dog that's incredibly hard, strong-minded, um, then you've got to be careful picking a battle with that dog because you don't want to make it even more strong-minded.
Mm.
Um, I, I, I'm going to digress, but
Yeah.
these things have stayed in my head for a very long time, and they are relevant. I had an art teacher who used to argue with another art teacher, and every time they argued, he'd go, "Just because I'm a man does not mean I'm not sensitive." And I used to hear this over and over again.
Yeah.
And I've had dogs who will not stop. They are
Mm.
headstrong, they pile into sheep, they can't lift sheep, and I've tried to stop those dogs, and they were all sensitive dogs as well. They weren't tough nuts in all of their life. So in
Yeah.
certain situations they still had a sensitivity. So it's sometimes by shouting at them you may actually make them more determined, you may make them
Mm.
more sensitive, you may just cause greater confusion which causes them to fight you even more. They may actually, instead of slowing down, they might try harder.
Yeah.
So we instilling that when they're younger is done through the lead work and everything else. But there is another aspect, which is I control access. I think you use the phrase showing them who's boss,
Yeah.
which is I don't quite see it as a boss. I see it as parenting.
Okay.
And so we constantly with children and we guide them. We tell them this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. So it's just controlling access. So I see that parents control access, and with sheep and young dogs, we need to control how they approach the sheep
Okay.
and how they go into a training pen, for example, or how they go into a field. So I would control the access. In other words, do not pull to get in there. So pulling on the lead or even arriving into the field before me is controlling is
Okay.
not controlling access. I want to approach the field together or you behind me. I remember many years ago seeing Aled Owen with his last Roy dog, and he was teaching the dog to walk behind him before before he went to the training. So that's controlling
Mm.
access. And then controlling access also means that if you're on the right hand side and your dog is on your left, they should maintain that position on your left. So if you imagine, if you go into a training pen and the sheep are in the middle of that training pen,
Yeah.
you are next to the sheep and the dog is on your left. Yep, on the fence side.
Yeah.
All young dogs are going to attempt to cut in front of you
Yeah.
to get to the sheep.
Yeah.
But if they have knowledge that they are not allowed to cut in front of you or cut in behind. So if you prevent a dog from cutting in front of you, they're going to go behind you
Mm.
if they're on a lead, this is.
Yeah.
And so once they have the knowledge that they can't cut in, they will actually stay true to the fence, and you can drop the lead and then say, come by away, whatever, and allow them access to the sheep. So the control comes uh, on the approach to the work, and then once you're in there, they should be armed with that information.
Mm. Yeah. I liked how you said that. So you see it as a sort of a parent and child sort of approach. I'd take that further. especially sort of me as a young handler, having now trained sort of fully trained a dog, I see, I'm fascinating how that relationship develops. Because yes, I agree at first it's like a parent and child, but then they come your equal. It's like a partner, sort of husband and wife. And then how I've experienced sort of an older dog that mam has. I find that like sort of like they're sort of my elder. They're sort of wise. They're sort of. It's funny
Sure.
how you know because their lifespan is so short. It's miraculous how you can sort of how you witness them growing up and growing past you as they've developed. It's something sort of fascinating and sort of really something special that we get to experience.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you. There is an opposite side to that as well, which is that I didn't start off in farming. So I came into this when I was about 25, and it's been a long learning curve. And I had dogs which were too strong for me. They were
Mm,
far too strong for me, and my natural instinct was to control them, to stop them. And then my thinking started to change that I'm new to this game, and these dogs are. I've selected the dogs. I've chosen these dogs because of their character, their temperament, all of these things. And I started to trust in the dogs a lot more. So if I had a pushy dog, for example, it was I would trust that dog a lot more. So I would rather than say you can't push the sheep, I would say, well, okay, push the sheep, give me your idea, uh,
mm,
show me why you want to push the sheep. And then I saw results which quite surprised me. So when you let a pushy dog push the sheep, they eventually develop an understanding of how to bring sheep to you, and they develop a confidence in the sheep. So the sheep know that they cannot outrun that dog, and therefore they actually slow down.
okay, yeah.
So there's many thoughts on especially old-fashioned ideas of how dogs should be able to bring sheep down a
Mm,
field without minimal commands.
yeah.
And some of the older pushy type dogs had a feel for their sheep because, well, did they have a feel for their sheep, or were they just allowed to develop the feel for their sheep by their handlers?
Yeah.
Because in yesteryear there were greater, bigger size flocks, and so the dogs were able to get closer to those sheep and learn. Whereas now it can be a little bit false in that we're training a lot more with smaller flock
Mm.
sizes.
Yeah, because a mistake sort of I've made up until recently, to be honest, was some micromanaging the dog when they're behind the sheep. Um, people told me in trials that they noticed it. I sort of whistle a lot at the dog because I think it's because I don't fully trust them behind. I'm sort of scared.
Yeah,
I'm sort of yeah. It's funny how when you let that because then after getting that advice, I went home and sort of she's a nearly 5 year old. I just let her, no commands. And it's funny how once you sort of metaphorically let that lead go, when you're not on top of them, how much they enjoy more and how much sort of the sheep flow better.
yeah,
You
yeah.
mentioned,
No,
oh, sorry, you
no,
go.
no, no. It's. I mean, that's what shepherding's about, isn't it?
Mm,
Is you use the word micromanaging, and that's exactly what it is, and that's the way I look at it, which is that I've done research. I've bred the dog or bought the dog on based on what I think is good breeding, and then you employ that dog. Why would you micromanage it? Because it's
mm,
like you employ somebody because they've got a certain skill set, and then you're telling them constantly what to do. Why don't you trust in the fact that you've done your research right? You've chosen the best dog for the job. Now let them get on with that job and assess whether they're capable of doing that job without your help or with when do they need your help. And that's when the partnership really starts to develop.
mm. You mentioned earlier about buying dogs and training your own. Um, Growing up, my gran had always told me because we were switching. It was when I was growing up. It was mum that trained the dogs, and then she would give them to us kids to sort of handle. And he always told me that oh, they never work as well for the new handler like they did for the handler that trained them. And then sort of I've not bought a dog yet. I've not experienced that for myself. What's your thoughts on sort of when you buy a dog versus training your own? Do you see much of a difference, or is it sort of a process you have to go through when you buy a dog to familiarize
I
each other with yourselves?
I've generally bought very few dogs. I think the reason for that was that when I bought the Fly dog, she was totally not what I thought I was buying.
Mm.
Which it was nobody's fault. It's just how genetics work. And so I had a lot of problems with her, not in terms of sheep. She wasn't quite the sort of type of dog I like, but I'm very nervous buying dogs because I like to have that early input in them from when they're born. I'm so incredibly loyal to my dogs,
Mm.
and people have laughed at me and because I've sometimes gone to the post with a dog that they know doesn't suit me, and I just
Mm.
think it's for me to bring out whatever the best is in that dog. So I tend to be a lot more loyal about buying now. Sorry, when it comes to breeding a dog rather than as opposed to buying a dog. I feel that the socialization process and that teaching of coping mechanisms to young dogs is better achieved if you're breeding your own dogs
Mm.
because you can influence them within what I call a critical period, which is around under 12 weeks of age. So research has shown that puppies who are given coping mechanisms and well socialized, the critical period is under 12 weeks. After that, you sort of stuck with what you've got.
Yeah.
So if you've not had an input in a dog because you've bought the dog at a year or 2 years or whatever, then I'm I would not have loyalty to that dog. I've recently trained a dog for a friend that had a large number of issues, and that dog, in many respects, was better than a couple of my dogs. And
Okay.
I thought this dog would go all the way to the top.
Mm.
He's got everything, but he's also got what I loosely term as a screw loose. And
Okay.
I wasn't responsible for that screw being loose. It was somebody else.
Mm.
And that dog was offered to me, and despite my thinking he could go all the way to the top, I said, no, I don't want that dog because I didn't create those mistakes.
Okay.
So I'm very definite in how I am in terms of breeding dogs or buying dogs. If I do buy, I want them very, very young.
Mm. You mentioned there, that dog that had the screw loose, and you said, "Oh, it wasn't you that made that; it was somebody else." Do you think that? I know it's obviously it's different to specific dogs, but if we go to sort of the idea, nature versus nurture, what they're born with versus what you instill in them, do you think that a dog that is a dog born with a screw loose? Is it something that develops? Is that something that develops in those 12 weeks that you talk about? What's your
Sure.
sort of idea between sort of what they're naturally born with and what a handler instills in them?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, because we've seen certain traits that crop up from certain lines repeatedly. And so when you're looking at traits that span a number of different handlers and they've all got the same problem,
Mm.
it's safe to assume that there are genetic bases to it because surely we're not all making the same mistakes. Nature is a big part. So in terms of the environment in which the puppy grows up and into an adult, into a working dog, there are some handlers, as you alluded to earlier, who can hide mistakes, and others find it difficult to cover up those mistakes. So nature has a bigger part to play. And like I said, I've worked with a lot of sensitive dogs. I've got perhaps the first ever sensitive male dog that I've ever had, and I bred him,
Mm.
and he would not work in my presence for up to 17 months,
Wow.
and I was like, well, goodness me,
Mm.
I've made a real mess of this job, and I don't know how I've done it because I I thought he was a hard dog
Yeah.
because of of how he came across. I thought he was a solid dog. Now he is. He is a
Yeah.
tough dog. And eventually, cut a long story short, I trained him at 17 months, but I didn't train him in a training pen because the closer we were, he didn't respond very favorably to that. He would walk.
Gosh.
Right up to 17 months, he was well, if you're watching, I'm not doing it.
Mm.
So I broke him on a hill, a 60-acre parkland, and just let him go. Because although I had no commands on him, I did have a recall on him. So that trust I was talking about earlier on, he knows if I call him back, he's going to come back. And that's all I had on him. I didn't have a stand on him. I didn't train him any basic obedience because I didn't want to fall out with him. So at 17 months, I took him to the park and he ran straight in a direct straight line to the sheep that were about 100, 200 yards away. And I called him back and he came back because that's what he does. And then he figured out to cast. I didn't tell him to cast, I didn't interfere. He just looked wide and I went away and off he went. He didn't know what away or come by was. He just has common sense.
Yeah.
And this dog brought maybe half of the sheep down to me
Okay.
at a rate of knots, and I didn't interfere with that. Um, and I told him to go back for the other sheep. Of course, he hadn't been trained to turn back, but he had enough common sense to turn back and go for the other sheep. So this showed me that actually I had bred the right dog. I just hadn't bred the right dog that he hadn't read the manual where I was
Okay.
concerned. So I totally ended up having to be flexible with how I trained him.
Mm.
And rather than set the agenda, whatever he did, he
Yeah.
taught himself. So I just facilitated that training. He was trained within 2 months, so by 19 months, he was fully trained.
Wow.
I'm not saying he was fully experienced because he
Mm.
had zero experience, but he did have experience of working on a hill. And
Okay.
then I made probably the biggest gamble of my life, which is a bizarre thing. I can't believe that we've 12 months have now gone by. I put him in open trials rather than work him in nurseries.
Okay.
Because in an open trial, I only ever took him to trials that were quite big,
Mm.
where I could allow him the opportunity to not stop at the end of the outrun, but just bring sheep to me. But he knew how to bring sheep. He just settled on sheep, be it fast. He had tremendous balance, and he's running the national for me. He's had 4 wins this year.
Gosh.
And if truth be known, I've only ever facilitated his training. I can't claim that I've trained him. He just has natural ability.
Mm.
And only now 12 months have passed, I'm now working on his shedding because he doesn't quite get why he has to shed one, two, three, four, or whatever.
Mm.
He lacks that real spark and aggression, but it's coming.
Yeah. Because that's the greatest challenge with training dog is the problem solving aspect of it. You can never sort of train the two dogs the same way. I actually heard somebody describe, I think it must have been on the television program, about how when the dog's born, you've got a blank canvas and it's the trainer's dog's it's the handler's job to sort of paint that canvas. I didn't quite agree with that. How I see it is a canvas, but because of sort of the natural tendencies and sort of the traits in the breeding, there's patterns there already. And as a handler, it's your job to sort of put those patterns together and make it make sense. So you talk about sort of traits and lines, and you said about breeding. I know a lot of people that study stud books that are very technical about the lines. I also know people that think, oh, it's just a genetic lottery. You could put a dog on a farm bitch and it could have the greatest thing in the world. Sort of what's your point of view when it comes to breeding? Are you very technical? Do you study dogs, which dogs suit each other, or do you sort of think, it's potluck? Potluck. What's your sort of ideas on that?
Well, I was taught many years ago by somebody that if there's an exception to a rule, it's not a rule. And
Okay.
in breeding, there are exceptions galore.
Mm.
Some people are incredibly lucky. Whatever they have, they succeed with. Some people are incredibly unlucky. I've been a bit more technical and scientific about what I'm looking for. Ultimately, in the simplistic terms, what I'm looking for is a dog that improves what I've got. So
Okay.
a dog that has traits which I think will be successful, that will be successful not only on the trial field but on the farm as well. I want a farm dog first. Although I'm gradually cutting down my farming, I still will always want a farm dog first. And so, no, I, I've both succeeded and failed with having a specific requirement. And no, I think that it's quite enriching that people do things in different ways and
Mm.
find ways of succeeding. It just shows that there's more than one way.
Yeah. I
But
find it I find it fascinating that you say that you want a farm dog first, because sort of and how I do it, I see my dogs a clear sort of difference. I've got farm dogs, I've got trail dogs. I find it fascinating that you say that. Sort of, do you what makes so with your dogs? Does a dog go from a farm dog, and then do you sort of nurture the more technical elements to go to the trial dogs? Do you believe a dog should be able to do both, both at the same level? How do you? I find it fascinating that you say that. Could you sort of elaborate? Do you see a difference, or do you see it the dog's a dog?
no, I think historically, I suppose I've been guided by when I started, and when I started, there was one dog for all occasions,
Mm.
and people were a lot more patient in terms of what they expected from a dog. So you had one dog, or two dogs, or three dogs, and you did all the jobs with
Yeah.
those dogs, and then you took them to the trial, and they were expected to do both. And
Mm.
some of the old-fashioned dogs had a tremendous brain, and they switched between farm work and trials, so they could work 500, and then they could adjust themselves to working
Mm.
with five. But of course, the difference was that people didn't expect um, dogs to be succeeding at such a young age.
Okay.
So, so if you look at, for example, with my Kai, I couldn't set a date on when I trained him. I had
Mm.
to wait 17 months. I've done 12 months of trialing with him, and I've told absolutely everybody I've spoken to this dog cannot shed.
Yeah.
But he's not three yet. Well, he's not supposed to be able to shed. Just because there are dogs out there that can
Mm.
do everything at 15 months, 12 months, whatever, does not mean that he fits that particular mold. And he's just an old-fashioned dog that takes 3.5, 4 years to mature. So you can ruin a good dog by putting too much pressure on them. And the way I look at it is that I've allowed him to be trained. I see that 60-acre parkland as being at university. That does not mean he's going to leave that training process with a degree. It just means that his knowledge is greater, But now that the trialing season's finished, he's back in the training pen.
Mm.
I was in the training pen with him yesterday, um, and he's better able to take the pressure, and he's doing all the juvenile things that that young dogs do. So his education has been back to front. He's gone to university first. He's been to open trials. He's competed in the national, and now he's back to primary school. And so
Okay.
he's entitled to be fed up if he wants to be. He's entitled to be sensitive if he wants, and he's
Mm.
entitled to be bored of work. So now he's just enjoying himself, and he will now only do farm work this winter primarily, and learn all those things that um, a dog has to do to achieve those tasks. So I'm just there to facilitate what he's doing. I'm not teaching him. I'm just giving him experience. And I think for the bigger trials, a dog that has experience is a better dog.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. Because I think when I was starting out, I think I was quite naive in my thoughts that once they got to 4 years old, they can have an outrun, they can drive, they can shed. And I thought, oh, that's it. They are fully trained. I have trained them. But now experiencing sort of what they're like beyond that point, I now don't believe there's such thing as a fully trained because you can always give them more experience. There's always
Hmm.
something else sort of to build on. You mentioned that you help other people train their dogs, and you've got people coming to you. Is there sort of common mistakes you see in handlers? Is because sort of being able to train and handle dog is such a unique skill, and I do believe it's a skill, it's an art almost. Do you see sort of common mistakes or maybe misconceptions about training dogs?
Um, there are there have always been plenty of misconceptions, and the common mistakes I see uh, is that people. I believe that if an experienced person trains a dog, you can train that dog in any order. You can teach a dog to drive before you teach them to fetch.
Mm.
But if an inexperienced or new handler trains their dog, I think it's got to be more rigid in terms of what they expect. Because if I teach a dog to drive, I'm still going to go back
Mm.
and retrace my steps. So, for example, with Kai, I'm taking him back now, like I said, to play school or nursery school, and I'm teaching him the bits that he should have learnt. And
Okay.
there's no harm in this. People have often said to me that they only see a training pen as being for young dogs, and I train all my dogs in a round pen, even for
Okay.
trials. That doesn't mean I don't train them anywhere else, but I solve all my problems there. So going back to basics and covering all of the bases is very, very important. And the other common mistakes is that people don't often look at the rules. People don't look at the etiquette for trialing, and there are
Okay.
huge. People also don't help their dogs enough. So, in other words, if you go to a nursery trial,
Mm.
then and the sheep are, let's say, not responsive to the dog on the lift, and they're running down the field, uh, and what people get drawn into is, oh, the sheep are running, I'm going to miss the gate. So rather than stop the dog, they'll flank the dog,
Mm.
thereby teaching the dog to panic that the sheep are running away. I better go and get them. Whereas the more experienced handler would actually just say, I told you to stop, you're going to stop.
Okay.
And you're not going to get away with the mistake. I, in my first nursery season, retired 26 times.
Wow. Okay.
And that was because my gut feeling was there is no way when you do something wrong, you are not going to proceed. You cannot, if you do something wrong, you cannot have those sheep. Well, that's how I am as a parent.
Okay.
You misbehave. You're not getting the goodies.
Okay.
So But then there comes a time, particularly for young handlers, where it can become too easy to keep retiring. Then there comes a time when you've actually got to go, okay, I've missed the fetch gates. Now I'm going to be perfect for the rest of the trial. So you've got to learn
Mm.
to sort of knuckle down and then fight for lines and fight for the points and make a statement that you're not giving up. Um, and we all know it's possible to win trials having missed a gate
Mm.
or,
Well,
or
you look at Kevin in the Supreme final this year. I think he missed the fetch, didn't he? And then went on to win. So it's definitely possible, isn't it?
it's exactly it's there's a big aspect for new handlers, which is how they cope with
Mm.
situations, and we don't. As a rule, nobody trains the handler. Nobody puts the emphasis on the handler
Mm.
uh, and the psyche of the handler and how you cope with all those people behind you and all those people laughing behind you and all of those things. And they're really important
Mm.
because it's nerve-wracking standing there with that little buzz that goes on behind you.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because, well, you've seen the sort of bitch I run
Yeah,
in the trial. She had a she has a problem with her outrun, and I sort of yeah, it's so demoralizing when you're out there. You sent the dog and it goes wrong, and you can't even get the sheep down. But then we were coming home from a trial one day, and she hadn't gone out properly, and I wasn't very pleased. And then my mum turns to me and said, "You don't realize how lucky you are." And I said, "What? That she doesn't go out?" She said, "No, that the fact that now you're struggling and the fact now that you go to trials and you can handle disappointment, that you can walk off the field with everybody thinking, why is he even bothering with the sheep? Because I've gone through the baptism of fire, if you like,
yeah,
that anything else from here is that, and I will take this experience of failing. It'll actually make me a better handler because I find that so in life the fear of failure sort of overwhelms people, doesn't it? And it stops you doing from what you're doing. But actually, you're forging yourself in the fire will bring you out sort of you'll come out better off in the end. It's something you told me in the North Wales trial, actually, that you said you asked people if they'd rather start off with a sort of an easy dog or a harder dog, and you said that everybody said easy, but you thought actually a harder dog would make you a better handler in the end. And that's something.
yeah. No, I've always I suppose I started with the hard dogs.
Mm,
The dogs I had in the past have made me who I am. It's not a book or a video or any person
mm,
that's made me like this. It's the tough dogs that I had, and they've made me more patient. They've made me calmer. They've made me quieter. They've made me more introspective about the mistakes I make. Um, and I think there's a lot of pressure on young handlers. It's great that young handlers can go out there and succeed,
mm,
but um, there's pressures on people, particularly with social media now.
mm,
It's always been the case with any sport. So I'm not saying trialing is a sport, but if you look at the sort of pressures on young sportsmen when they enter the arena, they are straight away compared with the greats of that sport.
mm,
Now, you're a young handler yourself, and the way I think is that, you are, it's almost an insult to say to you, you're the next Aled Owen or you're the next
mm.
Kevin. What about if I just want to be Robin?
Yeah.
I don't want to be
Mm,
these people. I want to be me, and I want to set my own benchmark. So, I totally agree that you give young handlers tough dogs, they're not going to achieve success too quickly,
mm,
but they're going to learn a skill which will stay with them for life. And this is the reason why I don't take dogs in for training. It would be easy to train somebody's dog for them, but what skill have they learned? Do they even know how to use that dog?
mm,
Whereas if you've trained a dog, you will train another and another, and if you're lucky, you will get people come to you for training, and you can pass that knowledge on.
Mm.
So yeah, I totally agree with your mum that yeah, it's empowering, and actually, when I last met you, I saw a young handler almost despairing at the inconsistency of his dog, and
Mm.
I said the same thing to him, that what if the dog's not the problem? Maybe it's just your perception. And then 2 weeks later, they went and won a trial with that dog.
Mm.
So it's possible. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves as handlers, and I think sometimes the greatest skill is that you need to learn to accept failure. A bit like the 10-year-old I was working with. His perception was wrong. He thought that the dog was beating him, and actually, in
Mm.
reality, it wasn't. It's a journey that you go through together, and if you fail, then accept that failure. There's a lot of talk about, it's so easy when you fail to blame the judge, or to blame the field, or blame the sheep, and strictly just concentrate on your processes. You concentrate on training your dog to your best of your ability, and then when you go and fail, then you go, well, I did my best, so what?
Yeah.
So, you wait for another day.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good way to end it. We've done close to an hour. Before people go, I know you said you haven't read it in a while, but I would like to point out that Nij has got an excellent book. I will make sure that there's links to it. I'm not just saying this that because you're here, but it's actually the first sheepdog book I ever read, because I was having problems with one of my dogs and this was on the shelf. So I would highly recommend it to anybody out there. It's a very good book. I would like to thank you very much for doing this. Is there anywhere you'd like to send people who are watching, maybe to see more of you? Is there anywhere you'd like to promote? Send them anywhere?
No, not particularly. I've got an online series which replicates my DVD, as it's available both on DVD, and then my last pairing, Cap and Pip. Their whole training process is available on the live stream, and that's very honest. It shows the mistakes as well, so it's important to show things going wrong, not just
Hmm.
everything's how edited. It's hardly been edited at all, so it's a very honest account of how things should be. And I'm always available for any young handler, or any handler to ring me for advice, chat, whatever, or just to bounce things off.
Yeah, no, you're very, very generous with your time. Fair play. So thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you for inviting me. Much appreciated.